So welcome everyone and thanks for joining ARB's webinar today on our proposals to change our process for internationally qualified architects who want to register in the UK. I think we've got some slides which we'll share to talk you through this. So we're going to present on our role, on the proposals that we're making about the changes to both the prescribed exam and the UK adaptation assessment. We'll ask your views on some of these things through some polls. We'll encourage you to complete the consultation, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask some questions whilst we're all live on here. So I'm joined by a couple of colleagues today. So first of all, I'm Rebecca Roberts-Hughes and I'm the Director of Policy and Communications at ARB. And I'm joined by Emma Matthews, who's the Director of Governance and International, and Brian James, who's the Director of Registration and Accreditation. So you'll hear from them shortly. But to kick things off, we wanted to reiterate ARB's role. So ARB is the professional regulator in the UK responsible for setting the terms for registration as an architect. And we set the competencies and also the standards of conduct and practice that architects have to meet in the UK. We do this because our role is to help protect the public. So there's a register, which means that anybody calling themselves an architect has the appropriate skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours to be able to practice as one. Most architects join the UK register through our accredited qualifications. So we have a role setting the qualifications that architects need. And you may have seen that we're currently in the process of moving over to a new educational regulatory system. We've been reforming how we do this. This means that in the future, architects in the UK, through UK qualifications, won't have to have an undergraduate degree in architecture. We expect a lot of them still will, but it won't be a regulatory requirement that is mandated by us. We're also introducing new competencies that architects will have to meet through their qualifications. And this is a new modern set of competencies to address what they must know and be able to do across design, safety, sustainability, and so on. So if you've qualified internationally outside of the UK, there are two different ways that you can register within the UK. The first is through the prescribed exam, which is what we'll talk through shortly, which we're hoping to change. And the other is through one of our UK mutual recognition agreements or memorandum of understanding that we've signed with international counterparts. And Emma will talk those through and the assessment that exists as part of those. And the reason that we have these assessments is that we have to ensure that the standards of competence that we set in the UK are maintained however people join the register. So we have to maintain that standard of competency and check it and be reassured of it, no matter how or where people qualified. So I'm going to hand over to Brian now to talk through the prescribed exam that we currently do.
Good afternoon, everyone. So what is the prescribed examination? So essentially, the prescribed examination, it's the structure, it's the process that we use to test for the equivalence of qualifications that are not prescribed or accredited by ARB. Now, the structure that we use for this assessment are the old or the outgoing criteria, and there are more than 40 of these across the three stages of our education and training process. As an applicant for a prescribed examination, in order to join the register, you would need to have a pass at the Part 1 prescribed examination and then a pass at the second Part 2 examination, and then also achieve a recognised accredited Part 3 qualification. The examination isn't an examination in the strictest sense of a written examination. Rather, it consists of a number of materials which are submitted and then assessed by a panel of architects. And you can see on the screen the elements that we require here are supporting material, a comparative matrix where the applicant would set out against those 40 plus criteria, their sort of experience and some examples of projects. And those criteria are assessed by a panel to decide whether the candidate would come forward for an interview. So the process at the moment is in two stages: submission of material which is assessed, and then that material which meets the requirement, the candidate would then have an interview with the panel to talk in more detail. Just very briefly, we know from previous candidates the number of issues that appear with examinations, and that's the complexity of this submission process. Issues with language, and also understanding the difference between Part 1 and Part 2 levels, as well as selecting appropriate examples that they submit as part of the submission process. So hopefully that brief introduction to what the prescribed examination is and the materials that we require as part of the submission process will help the discussion that we have now. But I'm going to hand over to Emma next to talk around the assessment processes. Emma.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. I just want to explain what we've been doing in relation to our mutual recognition agreements. So a couple of years ago, we had some new legislation which was passed and updated the Architects Act accordingly, and that allowed us to enter into mutual recognition agreements and memoranda of understanding with our counterpart regulators around the world. We've currently got 3 active arrangements in place. So we have MRAs with our counterparts in the USA, and we also have an MRA with our counterparts in Australia and New Zealand. And we very recently signed a memorandum of understanding with our counterparts in Hong Kong. So the UK adaptation assessment, this applies to all architects who are applying for UK registration through our MRA routes. So if you're looking to join the register through one of our MRAs, so that's our MRA with the USA or with Australia and New Zealand, then you must set our UK adaptation assessment before you're eligible to join the UK register. And the UK adaptation assessment tests preparedness or readiness to practice safely in the UK context. It's designed to test an applicant's knowledge of the legal frameworks, the processes, building procurement, construction planning and contract law that apply in the UK. So when you're practicing in the UK, the types of things that you need to be aware of and understand when you're carrying out your roles. The UKAA itself consists of an applicant submitting a reflective career summary. So that's really an extended CV. And it also comprises a professional interview with a panel of assessors. And to help prepare for that interview, we provide practice-based scenarios and a series of questions so that you can look at those in advance and know what the basis of the discussion at the professional interview is going to be. So it's a very open conversation. It's always centered around UK-specific scenarios. And then the assessors will listen to your answers, discuss them with you, and assess them against the relevant criteria. Once you've successfully passed the UK adaptation assessment, then you're eligible to join the UK register.
Great, thank you, Emma. So in a moment, we're going to talk through why we're making these changes. But first of all, we'd just like to do a quick poll to find out what you think about the current prescribed exam. So do you agree that ARB needs to overhaul the prescribed exam? And we'll just give 1 minute for you to answer that question. So do you agree that we need to overhaul the prescribed exam? Just a few more seconds to give your answer if you haven't already, and then we'll look at what the response was. Okay, so the overwhelming majority of you do think that we need to overhaul the prescribed exam. That's 69%, so more than 2/3 of you. 18% of you don't think we do, and 13% of you aren't sure. Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on then. Next slide, please. Great. So some of you might have attended an event that we held back in May of this year. We had a listening event on the prescribed exam, and the purpose of that was really to hear what you think about it. So we invited previous candidates, examiners, employers, and others who've expressed an interest in this topic. And we had 38 people join us online who had trained and qualified in Brazil, India, Iran, Nigeria, Serbia, South Africa, Syria, and the USA, amongst others. That was a really useful event. And we asked people within that, what one word would you use to describe your experience of the prescribed exam? And you can see the answers that we got on the screen here. So people told us that it was complicated, convoluted, frustrating, complex, and overtaxing. There's a lot more words on the screen there. People found it burdensome, humiliating, and unclear. Not one positive word came up within that session. People could say anything they wanted. We didn't get a single positive word. So we then held some discussions as part of that event, and we heard that the forms and procedures are complex and are difficult to understand and use. We heard that the criteria which ARB has historically used to accredit qualifications are quite hard to interpret if you're an architect rather than a learning provider or somebody who's involved in that accreditation process. So candidates felt that they had to guess what the criteria were trying to get at, and they also worried that they wouldn't be able to express themselves to examiners or have examiners understand what they were trying to demonstrate. We also heard it was difficult for them to put together the portfolio because the portfolio has to tell people what their experience is and what they were taught as part of their qualifications. And if you qualified, say, 20 years ago, that's quite a long time for you to have to go back and try and dig out what you were taught at the time and be able to prove it to people. We also heard that even if they're using more recent examples, it took a lot of effort, a lot of time and effort to compile it around doing your day-to-day job as well. We also heard that some people had difficulty with the assessment format of an interview. Again, that they might not have been able to express themselves, that they were worried that the examiners wouldn't be able to distill out what they were trying to show and say. And we'd also heard that we've got quite complex eligibility requirements. So as Brian's mentioned, the current prescribed exam is based on you showing that the qualifications that you've received in another country map onto the same criteria that we use to recognise qualifications in the UK. And because of that structure, we require that your qualifications have a certain duration to them. And this was a barrier for people from some countries. So for example, in the United States, architects would do a non-architecture initial undergraduate degree and then transfer to an architecture program as they specialise during their learning journey. And a lot of them were excluded due to that duration that we required. So in addition to that event, we also held a survey earlier in this year. So this was back in January of this year. We surveyed internationally qualified architects and EU qualified architects as well. And we think that the evidence that we heard from that survey could support us in developing a more targeted exam. So the majority of people who responded were EU qualified. We had 194 responses, and the survey demonstrated that there are some self-reported knowledge gaps amongst those EU and other internationally qualified architects, because 74% of them, so 3/4, undertook additional study or learning to bring their skills up to the level that's needed specifically within a UK context. So what we heard from them was that their design skills were absolutely equivalent, but there are specific contexts in the UK around planning law, for example, or the type of construction contracts that we ran here, which people felt that they needed additional training or learning in to be able to immediately meet that UK type of practice. So we think with that in mind, listening to what internationally qualified architects are telling us, there's an opportunity here for us to target the exam in a much more helpful way. Right, so now I'm going to talk through how we're proposing to change the prescribed exam in the UK adaptation assessment. I'll just note at this point that you can submit questions during this session, so I can see a few of you doing that already. At the end of this presentation, we'll be able to address those, but there should be a Q&A button for you, and if there's anything you'd like to ask us, please do type it in there and we'll get through as many of them as we can. So our proposals for the new exam. So first of all, we want the assessment in the future to be based on our new academic and practice outcomes. And these are the outcomes that we expect all accredited qualifications to be able to meet in the future. And we've introduced these through the education reforms that we've been working on for some years now and announced last year. The outcomes-based system, so looking at competencies that people have, means that we're focusing on what an architect knows and what they can do instead of what they were taught. So we would no longer ask candidates to map their academic qualifications and courses against a list of criteria, but we'd instead test their knowledge, skills, experience, and behaviours. And we think that based on the survey, this competence assessment will need to include something that's targeted at a UK-specific environment. So that's things around local planning law and construction contracts and so on, as we've just discussed. We also think that this new format that we're proposing could improve the eligibility requirements. So our current eligibility requirements are designed to match the UK requirements, including the requirements that we have here for a particular duration of practice experience. And this means that international qualifications need to have lasted a specific duration before somebody is eligible to apply to take the prescribed exam and join the UK register. So another consequence of us moving to an outcomes-based approach means that we don't need to require that specific duration anymore, and we think that this will simplify the eligibility requirements and open up this route to more architects. We also think that the outcomes-based approach of our new educational framework in the UK means that we're most interested in somebody's entire competence at the point at which they register. And this means that the assessment can be at one point only. It's a single gateway in the future. And this would be a change to our current system because we currently ask people to do a prescribed exam to prove equivalence for part 1 and then prove equivalence for part 2. And then we also require a UK part 3 qualification in addition. So rather than having those 3 separate steps, there will be one gateway for internationally qualified architects in the future. So ARB currently runs the prescribed exam in-house, and the same applies to the UK adaptation assessment. And this means that we have a small team of staff members who book in the candidates and check over their paperwork as part of their application. And we also have a pool of examiners that we employ to run the assessments. But looking at our role in UK education, we don't run degree courses. Universities and other education providers do that. We recognise or accredit those degrees that are run by universities. And we do that by setting the outcomes that the qualification needs to deliver in architects. And we also set standards that the learning provider has to meet around a range of issues, such as how they treat students and the type of service that they run. So we're proposing to shift our approach here to be similar to that one. We would not run the exam, we would accredit different bodies to do that, and we would set standards that they need to meet. Another option that we could explore as part of this consultation would be to have a contract with a provider rather than an accreditation model. And you'll see when you look to the consultation that we're asking you your views on the best way for us to do this. And the final change we're proposing is to the assessment methodology or the format of it. And we know there are lots of different ways of assessing competence, and we see that through our education role with the different ways that degrees assess people. So there are portfolios of project work, there are written and visual materials that people produce, there are knowledge assessments like an examination. So we'd like to reflect a more modern approach to assessment in the prescribed exam. We think that the future exam provides an opportunity for us to introduce an online gateway assessment of the UK-specific knowledge and readiness to practice in the UK context. And this would be designed to also operate as the UK adaptation assessment. So it would be an exam that people would have to sit online as part of the prescribed exam that would also stand alone as a new UK adaptation assessment. We would also invite providers to develop both this online test and subsequent competence exercises for ARB to accredit. And there might be a range of different formats for candidates to be able to choose from. So those are our proposals and what it is that we're intending to change. And we'd be really grateful if you could all tell us what you think through the consultation survey. We'll have a conversation with you today, but if you complete the consultation survey online, we can gather data on your responses to different things. And we can also ask you some questions about how we can treat your response, what type of a respondent you are, and we can look at what different groups think to make sure that we're looking at all of the different implications for different types of people. That's really important to us. But before we go into some questions, we are just going to ask you a quick question and then talk through the timelines of implementation. So our next poll is up now. It would be great if you could complete it. Do you think that the proposed approach that we've just talked through will simplify the examination process and remove unintended complexity and barriers? Just give you a minute to complete that. So do you think the proposals we've just talked through will be simpler and will remove complexity and remove unintended barriers? Okay, that's really helpful. So 66% of you, so that's 2/3 of you, think that the proposals we're sharing today will improve things. 14% of you don't know, 20% of you don't know, and 14% of you think they won't improve. Great, thank you. Okay, so final part of our presentation, Brian's going to talk through the timeline for us introducing these changes, and then we'll get on to some of your questions.
Thank you. So we've mapped out the things that we need to do in order to develop the changes that Rebecca has described, and we are looking at a period of time that we have started, but will run through towards the end of 2027, and I'm just going to talk through a number of those stages. So on the slide you can see that we're at the beginning of the consultation activity between October this year and January next year, and we're looking for feedback in relation to that. Once we have that, we will then the board will need to discuss and make some decisions on the policy changes, both to the prescribed examination and also to those international routes, and that we think that will happen in the summer of 2025. Following on from that, depending on the board discussion and decisions, we'll then commence the development of the new mechanisms that Rebecca has outlined, and we think that that work will need to take place between the summer of 2025 and the spring of 2026. Moving on to the next slide, if we may, we'll then start, having developed that work, doing further consultation activities within the summer of 2026, which will give us some more feedback about how our proposals will work, and then they will be taken to the board towards the end of 2026 for a decision. Once the board has made its decision, we will then start thinking about how we do the launch of the new approach. And as Rebecca mentioned earlier, we will start the formal approach to accredit providers or contract with anybody who will be delivering the assessment methodology. And then moving on to the final slide, which will take us into 2027, we're thinking that because of this transition process, we would start to deliver those first accredited examinations in the middle of 2027 through to the end of 2027, but recognizing that some people may be already in the system and we might need to maintain the existing prescribed examinations to allow people to conclude their assessments, that we would run those until late September 2027, which would allow people to still join the register, but at that point the prescribed examination model would cease and all of the assessment activity would take place through the new approach. So hopefully that will help to set out the timeline between where we are now and September 2027.
Great, thank you, Brian. So we're going to move on to taking some of your questions now, but before we do that, we're just going to share one last poll with you. So the poll should pop up on your screen now. So do you think ARB should aim to accredit a range of assessment methodologies or one single assessment methodology? So when I was talking through our proposals a moment ago, we said there are lots of different ways of checking competence. And do you think that people should have a range of different options by different exam providers to choose from? Or do you think there should just be one assessment format that applies to everybody? Let's give it another moment for you to answer that. And this is one of the consultation questions we're asking as well. So again, when you complete the consultation survey, please do let us know what you think and your reasons for suggesting that, because we're looking for the best way to do this. Okay, that's really interesting. So a third of you think there should be one assessment format that should apply to everybody. 59% of you think that there should be multiple assessments and people should be able to choose them. That's really helpful, thank you. Okay. So we'll stop sharing the slides now and we'll move on to some of your questions. I'll just note now that this session is specifically about our proposals for the prescribed exam, the UK adaptation assessment. So we're holding this event as part of our consultation process to have a conversation with you about those changes. Some of you are writing in with very specific questions about your own circumstances and are outlining the different qualifications you've received in different countries and whether or not you're eligible to take the exam. So we're not going to address those today. What we really want to do is spend time talking through our proposals and understanding your views on them. If you do have specific questions, first of all, do go to our website. If you look, there's a section for internationally qualified architects that should help you understand the eligibility criteria as they currently stand, and whether or not you're eligible to sit it and what you would have to do. And if your answer, if the question you're asking isn't answered there, then you can send an email to ARB at info@arb.org.uk. So that's how you find out the answer to those questions. Some of you sent questions in advance, so we're going to take a couple of those to start with, and then we'll start looking at those that you've submitted. So first of all, we've had a question from Gavin, which is there a timescale for the adoption of the proposed changes to the outgoing prescribed examination process? So Brian, you've obviously just talked that through, but could you give a bit more of a specific answer about when we would shift from the old current process to the new one?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for the question, Gavin. So I think the key time is the sort of first quarter of 2027 when we would start to deliver the new approach. I think the thing that, because this is a transition period, and you know, we would have to react to people with existing international qualifications that may be part way through their process. So for instance, they may already have taken a Part 1 prescribed examination, but need to take a Part 2 prescribed examination. We would need to understand the amount of activity that we would need to do within that period. So we're anticipating and planning for an increase in the number of prescribed examinations that we would offer and hold throughout 2026 and early 2027, but then we would envisage that the volumes would change slightly with a sort of run-out period and a reduction in prescribed examinations as 2027 continues through to, as I said, the end of September 2027, when the examination would no longer be offered. Obviously, what we would be doing is we would be offering support and guidance to people who think that they may need or want to take the prescribed examination, and would be working very closely with those people who are already somewhere through the process to assist them if they need to continue with a prescribed examination during that period. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Brian. That was really helpful. So I'm going to go to a question that Lara sent in advance, and I can see a few of you have asked similar questions online as well. So Lara's asking, will a recognition agreement be reached with EU states? Emma, I wonder if I could come to you on that one.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Laura, and others for the question. So we've been in active dialogue with our European counterparts for some time. We're working our way towards an agreement. We're really keen to keep engaging and keep talking to our counterparts about this. We haven't got a fixed timeline as to when an agreement might be reached, but we're all working really positively. And as and when we know more and can publish more about this, then we will do that via our website and social media channels.
Great, thank you, Emma. I've got a question here which I'll answer from Humaira, which was sent in advance. So will any special consideration be given to internationally qualified architects who've also successfully cleared an ARB Part 3 in the UK without having a Part 1 and a Part 2? So the answer is no, we would not treat that differently, because the qualifications that we require for people to join the register are a whole. There are different things that are tested and required at different stages within that qualification process. So for us to skip any part of it would mean that the competence that's required to join the register wouldn't have been assured and proven. Before we move on, just want to check, Brian, whether there's anything you'd want to add on that particular answer.
No, I think that's fine, Rebecca.
Cool, thank you, Brian. And whilst I've got you, Brian, we've had a question in from somebody live, which I think it would be good for us to answer now. I'm just going to try and find it. So it's here from Masumi. So Masumi is saying, if there is going to be a single exam, how is it going to work for somebody who's completed their Part 2 and Part 3 in the UK, but their Part 1 elsewhere? And of course, this is an interesting question, because as part of our education reforms, we're moving to a new system of no longer requiring an undergraduate or a Part 1 degree. So it's part of the big shift that we're doing. Brian, would you be able to answer that for us, please?
Yes, certainly. Thanks for the question. So with a currently prescribed Part 2 and a currently prescribed Part 3, before 2027, which is when this change is envisaged would take place, we would still require either a Part 1 qualification or to take the prescribed examination at Part 1. However, once we have made the changes that we're talking about here, we would require a simple assessment, which would be part of the assessment process that we would be developing. So we would not require a Part 1 qualification or to take the prescribed examination, but there would be an additional single simple assessment that would allow entry to the register with those existing Part 2 and Part 3 qualifications.
Great, thank you, Brian. Emma, I'm going to come to you with a question now. So this has come in advance from Priscilla. So she says, will there be any difference to international qualified architects outside the EU or Commonwealth nations? For example, those with working experience in the UK and on the route for citizenship application, would it be a different process?
Again, thank you for the question. So our current recognition agreements have no nationality or citizenship requirements within them. So we don't have anything that you need to meet around that. As it stands and currently, there are two ways of joining the register. You can either use our mutual recognition agreement route plus the UK adaptation assessment, or the prescribed examination route that we've been talking about. What we're looking to do in the future, there will still be two routes available. So we would have the new and more modern version of the UK adaptation assessment, which will still form part of the MRA route. And then we'll have the single gateway that Rebecca has been describing.
Great, thank you. So I've got a question that I'm going to come to you on, Brian. So Ritesh has asked, if somebody has failed on the current exam process, can they apply again for the new examining process?
Okay, thanks for the question, Ritesh. So if I could just say very briefly a little bit about the current process. So when people take the examination, they may fail the examination, but then they can retake it a second time. There's also another category of the examination output where additional work can be completed and submitted back to the examiners, and then an assessment made as to whether they meet the prescribed examination requirement. That will continue as part of the existing process until the prescribed examination ceases to be offered. So we would hope that anybody who is in the process who may not have been successful the first time would use those options in order to be successful and therefore to be able to join the register. If the person were to exhaust those options, then they would need to apply and they would be able to take the new approach, but as long as they met the criteria for the new approach. So hopefully that helps.
Great, thank you, Brian. Emma, I'm going to come to you to a question. I think it's very similar to the one that you've already answered. But somebody is saying, how will the registration to ARB from European countries will work? So would you just repeat what you were saying about how this will apply to people who've qualified in European countries?
Yes, so those with European qualifications can currently apply to ARB, provided they have European qualifications which are set out in a protected list of qualifications from Europe. We have that list, and provided you have qualifications from that list, we'll accept you onto our register. In the future, we're looking to replace that arrangement with a new mutual recognition agreement. And that's what we talked about a little bit earlier. We're still working on that. We're discussing that with our European counterparts. And when we're able to talk more about that and have more information and a timeline, we will share that more widely. But what we're looking to do is establish a new route, a new mutual recognition agreement with our European counterparts. And then the new form of our UK adaptation assessment would apply to that as part of the mutual recognition agreement. For those who fall outside of the current arrangement or any future mutual recognition agreement, there will always be the prescribed exam route or the mechanism that replaces that, so the single gateway.
Great, thank you, Emma. So I'd seen an anonymous question that's come in that's asking if you're going to have potentially multiple assessment formats, won't that lead to multiple standards being set across those different formats? So having more than one way of people taking an assessment and exam, what would that mean for standards? So I'll kick up this answer and then hand it over to Brian for a bit more detail. But the short answer is no. Having different assessment formats wouldn't introduce different standards because our accreditation process that we would mirror on the new exam would set standards that all providers would have to meet. Brian, I wonder if that's an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how we apply the accreditation model to qualifications at the moment in the UK and how we would replicate that for the new exams.
Yeah, certainly. So our accreditation process uses visiting panels, which consist of both lay and architect members who will receive information about the way that a qualification is delivered. So whether that's the content, the technical aspects, or also the assessment methodology or the teaching methodology. And that visiting panel scrutinizes that information and the approach, does a visit and makes a recommendation to our accreditation committee, essentially saying that the qualification does or does not meet the board's requirements. So the approach that we would take if there were a difference or a sort of different innovative ways of delivering an assessment methodology would be to do exactly that. We would take the information about the way that an assessment would be run. We would look at how and who would be doing that assessment, and we'd be looking at how they would quality assure for consistency purposes. So the mechanism for delivery of the assessment may be different, but those architects and lay visiting panelists would be making a recommendation to our accreditation committee on that.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. So I'm going to take a couple of questions quite quickly because they've got quite simple answers. So one person has asked, will the competency requirements that are set in the UK, the competency outcomes, are they going to be the exact same ones that are applied through the prescribed exam? And the simple answer is yes. The competency outcomes that we set for people in the UK, and that the anonymous attendee here has said, the ones in Tomorrow's Architects, that's absolutely right, it's those ones. Those new competency outcomes apply to anybody joining the register in the future, no matter what route they join through. So that apply to UK qualifications, and they will apply here as well. Next question I will take is about what's going to happen between now and the implementation of the new route. So I think Brian's talked about that a little bit, but Martha has sent something in advance, and I can see a question from Juliana on here as well. I'll kick off and then hand over to you, Brian. What will happen between now and the implementation of the new route? What if somebody needs to qualify before 2027? Should they follow the current process, which Martha is describing as tedious? So hopefully, Martha, you think that the proposals will improve upon that. But the simple answer is yes, we will transition to a new process, but until we do so, the current prescribed exam will remain in place. Brian, is there anything else you'd want to add to that?
I'm just looking for Juliana's question, or did you want me to go into that one? Sorry.
So it's the same question on both counts. It's do people have to do anything different in the interim? Is the prescribed exam, as it currently stands, the only option between now and 2027?
So if yes, that is the case.
Great, thank you. I can see Juliana's question there. Great. Okay, well, let's just go to another poll for a moment so that we can ask you what you're thinking about what you're hearing today so far. So yes, if we move on to the next poll that we've got. Great. This reflects some of the questions that I've seen coming in as well. And people are saying, should there be some sort of conversion course? So this is a question we're really interested in. Should courses be made available to candidates to help them prepare for the assessments? Wow, okay, so that's an overwhelming majority. So the majority of you think that, yes, those courses should be made available. So I wonder if there are any providers on the line today who might be interested in exploring that opportunity. Great, I've got a question that I'm going to put to Emma now, and it's from John. So John is saying that the Australia and New Zealand MRA that we have in place seems less onerous than the one that we have in place with the USA. Emma, I wonder if you could talk through the difference between those two MRAs for us and the different format of them, and indeed whether we do see it as something that's less or more onerous.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you, John, for the question. I wouldn't say that one is more onerous than the other. I think they do slightly different things. So our US agreement is what we call a registration level agreement. So you need to be licensed or registered in the UK or the US to be able to benefit from it. So we have that level of recognition there. And on our side, if an American architect's coming to the UK, you need to go through our UK adaptation assessment. And similarly, a UK architect going to the US will need to go through a relevant jurisdictional level assessment if the relevant US state applies that. For our Australia and New Zealand agreement, we've got 2 tiers of recognition. So this one's a little bit different. So we do have the registration level tier of reciprocity and mutual recognition. So again, if you're registered in Australia, New Zealand, or the UK, you can move at that level. But we also have a tier of recognition after the master's level qualification, or after part 1 and 2 for UK candidates and applicants. So you can move at that level and then complete your training in the other country. So they do slightly different things, as I said. For architects, moving from the UK to Australia, they similarly have a jurisdictional test, which is very similar to our UK adaptation assessment. So I think that they're balanced, and I wouldn't say that one is more onerous than the other. They just do slightly different things at different levels.
Great, thank you, Emma. I've seen a few questions coming in which I can take on what the cost of the new exam will be. So somebody has asked, is it going to be cheaper? What is it going to cost? And the simple answer is we're at such an early stage in the process that we're not able to answer that at the moment. So one of the things that we're aware of is that anything that ARB does, and we do currently run this in-house, has to, by law, operate on a basis of cost recovery, which means that the charges that we set are commensurate to what it costs for us to run it. This is something we'll have to consider really carefully if we do move to an accreditation model, because other organisations running it would not be bound by law in the same way that we do. So we would set an expectation that the cost would be similar or lower. But again, that's something we're really interested in from this consultation, whether people think that we would be able to reduce the cost or keep it the same, or any feelings that they have about how we should handle that. Okay, so to take another question in, so somebody has asked, have we looked into similar processes in other countries? And they've said like Canada. So Emma, I'll come to you on this one. What have we seen in other countries, and whether or not a similar model is applied elsewhere? And I think we're talking here about our move towards an accreditation model.
Yes, so we have benchmarked with our counterparts and the processes that they have in place. We'll very much kind of take that into consideration as we move forward, and have indeed been doing that as we've been developing our initial proposals. Certainly around the development of the UK adaptation assessment, which we're hoping to make a little simpler and more accessible. We have been looking at models that exist already, particularly in Canada, particularly in Australia, and through some of our other networks and counterpart regulators. So I think there are opportunities there for us to learn from others, and we'll certainly be taking that into account. Rebecca, I think you're muted. Apologies.
Thank you, Emma. You're absolutely right. I was. I'll repeat myself. Thank you, Emma, for your answer to the question. Brian and I both talked through the timelines and when these changes are going to come in, but I can see from the questions we're getting that people are still asking for a little bit of clarity here. So one person, Juliana, is asking us to clarify if somebody finishes their Part 3 between now and the new assessment coming in, so between now and 2027, can they wait for the new system in 2027? Particularly if they don't, to avoid having to sit the Part 1 and Part 2 examinations. So the question here is, what does somebody do? Would they still need to do a Part 3 in the future, or are they able to wait until 2027 and sit the new prescribed exam? And to kick things off before I hand over to you, Brian, I think it will each depend for all of you on what stage you're at. If you've already completed your Part 3, then it's going to be a really valuable qualification for you, which stands you in good stead when it comes to the new prescribed exam that we will bring in, particularly given that we will be testing that UK competence. And under the current system, it's absolutely required. So I think it's a question for individuals to consider about where they're at in their qualification journey and what best to do. But Brian, would you summarise for us, as of 2027, what the eligibility requirements will be, and what the new process would look like for people?
Yeah, so we developed a whole range of options. So if somebody has, for instance, a current Part 3, but does not have a Part 1 and a Part 2, currently they'd need to take their Part 1 and Part 2 prescribed examination or that qualification. But from 2027 onwards, they would complete an accredited academic outcomes master's level qualification, which would then fit with their Part 3 qualification. Does that help answer that question?
I hope so. Thank you, Brian. So there's another question I found that's come in from Yemi, which says, will the new route require submission of portfolios and proof of experience? So this is a really good question, but I think it's looking slightly further ahead than where we are at the moment. So what we are saying is that we think that new and more modern assessment formats are possible. At the moment, candidates, as Brian outlined at the beginning, have to map all of their experience against the criteria that we look to map universities against. And that would also include submitting a portfolio of experience. What we're saying is we think that other ways of undertaking assessments are possible, and we would like to accredit those new assessment formats, but we're not stipulating what they should be at this point in time. We're consulting with all of you on a shift to accrediting those new assessments that third parties would provide rather than running it ourselves. And part of the reason that we're exploring the potential for there to be multiple assessment formats is that we think that different candidates would prefer to be assessed in different ways. Some of you might prefer a face-to-face exam. Some of you might prefer a portfolio model. What's really important is that the competency is proven to the adequate level, and that people have an opportunity to be able to prove their competence and their experience match. So looking at the time, we've got 10 minutes left, but I think a lot of the questions that we've got in have already been answered one way or another. Those of you who are still sending in questions which are about your own specific circumstances and what you're able to do, I would encourage you to go to our website and look at the international routes section of it to understand what the opportunities are for you. And I would also encourage you, if your answer isn't there, to email us at info@arb.org.uk, and somebody will get back to you. I can see a couple of comments of here, people saying they've tried to phone up and get an answer, but really, if you email us, we'll be able to get back to you within a certain number of working days, as quickly as possible. And it also means that we can look things up before replying to you, check your specific circumstances, and be able to answer that there. So I think just checking whether any new questions have come in that are about any new topics. As far as I can see, we've answered as many as we can. There's one here, somebody is asking, why can't the single gateway be implemented right now through the current prescribed exam? I can answer that one. That's because the exam is specifically set up to check that people have been taught particular things at different stages in their career, and are the rules and the guidance that we've written that we have to adhere to ourselves states that we are looking for an equivalent qualification. And that's part of the reason the proposals that we've talked through today are multifaceted and have a range of different changes. We can't just pick and choose what we change. This is a real system level overhaul, which is part of our intention with our education reforms as well, of addressing the new competencies that are required in a changing world and trying to remove as many barriers as possible. Okay, so I can't see any final questions coming in. Just see what people are saying. Asking for a repeat of the email address. So that's info@arb.org.uk. And then you'll also find all of our materials online. And you can find out our website address. I think we can send that through to all of you afterwards. We'll send through the details that we're consulting on, where you can learn more about all the proposals and how you can get in touch with us. Great. Any final comments from Emma or Brian?
No, nothing from me, Rebecca.
No, only to repeat the do get in touch with the team if you have specific questions, because the complexity we can answer about individuals much easily through an email.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of you. I'm sorry if we didn't get through your own individual questions, but as Brian says, do email them through to us if we haven't covered them today. Please do complete the consultation survey, and thank you again for your time. We really hope that the changes we're proposing will open up this route for as many people as possible and make sure that we have a competent and accessible register. So thank you, everybody, and look forward to hearing from you all.